By the early 1980s, arcades are everywhere.
Well, they popped up everywhere. You know, 7-Elevens would carry them. By the time we get to the middle 80s, grocery stores are carrying them. The funny one, of course, is at least one funeral home had a couple of arcade machines in its basement. It was an incredible phenomenon at that time. In 1981, Americans dropped 20 billion quarters into arcade machines. They spent 75,000 years playing arcade games in 1981.
The media takes notice as arcades become part of popular culture.
But at this point now we've reached a peak where, you know, it was now okay for middle-class people to go into arcades.
The arcade crowd back in the old days was really weird because you definitely had all the little scrubs like me, you know, like little kids who were riding their bikes there, and then you had like high school students and you had college students. It was mostly the guys, but you had the girls kind of hanging there looking at what was going on. But then it was also really weird because you had like businessmen. It was really weird because it wasn't like a kid phenomenon. It was like really across the board phenomenon in terms of who was playing arcade games. I think the golden age was like in the early to mid 80s, you know, when you had like all the amazing Midway games and the Atari games. Games like Joust, Robotron.
The games I really loved were Asteroids, Missile Command, and above all, Defender.
Defender came out and that was like changed the world.
And thanks to people like Eugene Jarvis, creator of Defender and Robotron, the hits just keep coming.
Eugene is a wild man. Eugene is a poster boy for something in our industry, I'm not sure what.
Defender was cool because you'd see it and it was only the older kids could play it because it was so intimidating. There's like 1,000 buttons. I remember like trying to play it a few times and couldn't get anywhere with it.
Defender was the ultimate game for the hardcore gamer. It had 7 buttons. I mean, I don't think any other game had that degree of control complexity. Just trying to keep track of them would drive you crazy. I think my right pinky is still kind of crooked from having spent so many hours pushing that control up and down.
I finally learned how to play it. That was pretty... I would describe that as a life-changing moment. And so we sat there and played it like the whole day, like, you know, until my mom dragged us out of there.
But I loved Robotron, and I thought that was a really, you know, fantastic game.
Robotron, which is one of my favorite games, I actually liked it so much I actually bought it. That's one of those games that, you know, be shaking by the time I got back after playing for an hour.
As the industry peaks, originality is a must.
The golden age of the arcade was incredible. The creativity, I've never seen anything like it. Every game had to be original, 100% unique. This was the attitude at Atari. We didn't do driving games because there had been a driving game. If you did a driving game, it had to be a driving game with guns, and then there could only be one of those in the industry. I had a friend who made a driving game where you drove on the ceiling, because that was the only way you could get it through this corporate culture where 100% originality was required.
The business of gaming looks good.
Like today, where they're talking about how the game industry is eclipsing the motion picture industry in terms of revenue. That was very much the case back then as well. The revenue from video games was enormous. I mean, a good game would bring in 800 to 1,000 in a week. So you'd buy the game, and in 2 weeks, you know, you pay off your, you know, the distributor, and fine. And there were a lot of arcades, a lot of places where there were video games.
But the market can only grow so much. Soon, the arcade reaches critical mass and becomes a victim of its own success.
Ironically, when I arrived at Atari in 1982, we were saying, we're so big. The coin drop in these games is just as large as theatrical revenue for movies. Now, does that sound familiar? What had happened is we pretty much saturated the market. The games did not get obsolete very quickly, and we filled the arcades with them, and we were starting to fill secondary locations like Safeways and 7-Elevens and dentist offices. By the middle of 1982, we were just full.
A lot of it was oversaturated in the market in 81, 82, especially 82-ish time frame. And we sold thousands and thousands of games that went into dentist's office, you know, besides normal arcades in street locations like bars and restaurants and bowling alleys. And it got to the point there were so many games out there that they couldn't support the amount of earnings to really justify buying them.
It was a fad. I think there's no other way to put it. It was like early rock and roll, really. Enough people started coming and enough companies started making games, it just kept growing, you know, and people built bigger and bigger ones until finally, you know, the whole thing just sort of collapsed under its own weight.
Now, the arcade machines that were so successful just a year ago are no longer making enough money to support the market.
By the time the early 80s came around, the economic life for a lot of games, for simple games, and the simple games were those that everybody was playing, was probably less than a year. Well, the games cost enough that they really needed to have an economic model that would last for several years in order to pay for them.
And the home console market takes a bite out of the arcade as well.
The other thing that people will point out is that their home consoles started getting better about this point. The Atari 800 and other stuff started coming out. And the consoles, you know, artwork used to be so different. You know, the arcade would be here and consoles would be down here. The discrepancy started narrowing, and they started affecting our business.
Yeah, I definitely think the rise of the consoles really have hurt the arcade overall, because there's just not much you can do on an arcade machine that you can't do on a home console.
Bloodied and bruised, the arcade market looks like it's down and out. But only time will tell.